welcome everybody to this really historic event, which is actually going to be filmed all afternoon as well. So bear that in mind as we go forward. Welcome to all of you who've come from so far, to all our panellists who are going to be contributing this afternoon. Thanks to Cynthia Beaujeu and Ed Bastian. Together we've been organising this event, and it's so exciting. My name's Heather Beasy. So on behalf of the Aspen Chapel, a really warm welcome. I'm just going to mention 3 or 4 tiny housekeeping things, and then we'll pass over to Cynthia. As I said, it is going to be, this is being live streamed. Welcome to everyone live streaming as well. When it opens up for discussion, there are going to be a mic this side and a mic that side. And if you want to contribute to any conversation, please make sure you speak into a mic. With a lot of people, we haven't quite got enough loos in this place. So if you haven't found them already, there are loos that end and this end of the downstairs. That's where the loos are. Everything that you'll use in terms of cups and everything is compostable. So please put all your cups in the compost bins, and if you can, reuse your cups so we don't get through hundreds of them. And that's it. This is such a special occasion. It's been a long time coming. We're so thrilled to have you here. So thrilled to have Cynthia and Ed and all the spiritual paths people. Silence cell phones. Please silence your cell phones. And with that, I'll pass over to Cynthia.
I don't need it. I got my, yeah. Good afternoon. Wow. So wonderful to have us here to celebrate, not so much to celebrate the memory of a departed beloved friend, as to celebrate the presence of one who continues to guide, to shape, to touch our hearts, and through our transformed hearts, to touch the world, in a world crying for hope, for joy, for compassion. We consider those of you who come, all of us, not to be an audience, but to be a listening body. There is no audience here. We are all participants in collectively celebrating and collectively discerning where we are with our beloved teacher. Many of you have known this teacher for decades. And the wealth of intimacy, experience, and love that resides in this room could be packaged, and it would light up the city of Aspen in light forever. So we are part seminar, part inquiry, part celebration, all listening, and all prayer. And what you bring to this, your attention and your open heart, is going to be as much a part of this as any information you might give or hear. So we begin in the only way that we can appropriately begin, with a wonderful invocation. We're here to celebrate the interspiritual legacy of Thomas Keating, and as the beautiful karmic luck would have us, our beautiful beloved friends, the Buddhist monks known locally as Lexi's monks, are here doing their July sabbatical. And will, in a truly international, interspiritual, one world, colorful way, invite us into this space of prayer. They will chant for about 15 minutes, and then we will collectively sit for 10 minutes to really set the space together for the work that will go on. So.
Oh, Joy, 季节节外团结，人所灭者轮不突外，今年那是那样遇见，万年所言烈烈同我。爱的爱
Thank you to the monks for that beautiful introduction. Do we have a Tibetan Buddhist speaker among us that can tell us what were the chants, Ed?
You know, sir?
What?
It was a special chant from their monastery, and some of it was all Mani Padme Hum, which was to Chenrisi, to Avalokiteshvara.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a very standard part of their liturgy from their Tibetan monastery, and a good deal of it had to do with Avalokiteshvara, or Chenrisi, who was the deity, or the emanation of the Buddha, that the Dalai Lama is meant to be an incarnation of.
Terrific. We had told them that they will be introducing our joint celebration and collecting of energy around our own master. They got it. You could hear it in your heart, even if you don't speak a word of Tibetan. So, welcome once again to this wonderful, I hate to say historic event, but what else can you say? That when we put it together, there was this deep sense, and many of us in the Valley know, that Thomas Keating left behind when he died last October two powerful legacies to the spiritual seekers of this world. Perhaps the more well-known by many, many people is his contribution of centering prayer, a very simple method of meditation which allowed people of a Christian orientation to actually get into the game with meditation. And it succeeded in bringing the kind of deep, contemplative, transformative processes which up to that point had been kept alive only in monasteries, out into the world, so that they could join the great groundswell of practices that were emerging from the other traditions in the extraordinarily transformative and liberating processes that are unleashed in a person when meditation becomes central to your practice. So he's well known for contemplative prayer, for centering prayer, the founding of contemplative outreach, and for his developing of a conceptual framework of what happens on our journey when we start this program. How does the purification happen? All along, though, there was another lineage that he kept touching base with, and which was actually the cradle out of which his work with centering prayer emerged. And that was his deep, long-standing love for the interspiritual, contemplative dialogue and cross-pollination. Even at the very beginning, when he was the abbot back in the monastery in Spencer, Massachusetts, centering prayer didn't arrive in a vacuum. He asked his buddies, a Buddhist Roshi who had been teaching the monks koan work, and his friends in TM, to come and help him develop a practice that would put the Christian to contemplative wisdom into a format that would be accessible by modern people in the world. So even at the start, it was midwifed within his interspiritual love and container. And as he went on, that container got stronger and stronger, and he birthed three singular interspiritual children. The first being his Snowmass Conference, which began in 1984, when he invited a bunch of random practitioners from various traditions to come together, not to do interreligious dialogue, which is talk, 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 he said, she said, but to pool their hearts and their common contemplative wisdom and speak out of that into what their traditions held in common, how they saw it differently, but to develop a deep bond of friendship and oneness. That conference, continued for 25 years or more, and some of the original participants are with us today. It was catalytic, not only to what is done in spirituality, but to the style in which it's done. And we're modeling and following that style today. Along the way, one of the people who showed up as one of the representatives at that conference was our own local Valley resident, Ed Bastian. who said, you know, we could turn this into an institute and take it out as a teaching and formation program in the world, including others in it. So that was the birth of Spiritual Paths. And 6 of us got together as the original core faculty in Spiritual Paths, and that was the second institution founded by Thomas. He remained the spiritual father of Spiritual Paths to the end of his life. And then right at the end, always interested in where the future was pulling us in one world, he founded the Younger Contemplatives Network. And while it wasn't specifically interspiritual in its design, it acknowledged the fact that most contemplative spiritual folks he knew under 30 today are exquisitely religiously bilingual. In other words, serious practitioners in at least a couple of paths. And so that to be a younger contemplative today is by nature to be interspiritual and interreligious. And he pulled that group of people together to talk about the legacy as a two-way street. Not only what we would pass down to the next generation, but how the next generation with their insights and their understandings would change the very way contemplation was understood in the traditions. So we have folks from that group too. 3 great interspiritual initiatives which were also cooking in this valley. When he died last fall, his great work as a Christian leader and teacher was brilliantly celebrated. But there was a feeling that this third piece had been left unclosed. There was no opportunity to pull back together and evaluate and access and assess what he had left in this scattered sort of interspiritual network. And there was a sense that that was necessary, partly because so much of his own final stages in transformation are bound up in reference points that only really exist within the interspiritual network. Some of them exceed the known roadmap in his Christian upbringing. So it's the interspiritual container and his visions of non-duality and oneness that really he was experimenting with his little think tank, his interspiritual gang, that says an awful lot about where he arrived and what he left us with, and also, incidentally, what we do today. Far more than Christianity, some of these great traditions of the world understand what it means when a great master passes, particularly at cusp points in human history, what we're invited to, what opportunities lie there alongside the grief, and what we are called to. And so it's these factors that we thought were really important to not just let slip out like water from a sieve, but to collect and hold and pass on. So that was the generation, that was the genesis of this conference. We invited target representatives from those 3 great lineages he founded, just to make sure we got people there from all of those places, most of whom don't live in the valley. And these people, Ed finally hit on the wonderful idea of calling them program resource consultants, which is perfect, because the group is all of us. And that the people who came and who began work last night and this morning are really yeast, leaven in the lump, to work that goes on with all of us here, and in which we invite your input as full participants, lovers and beloveds and students and friends of Thomas, as we continue to try to flesh out the pieces of what it is that he left us. We're part seminar, we're part celebration, we're part Snowmass conference, deep inner listening. And this morning we were already shown in wonderful ways that his living spirit and the living spirit of some higher wish for human purpose accompanies on us and brings forth surprise. And I fully expect that will continue to happen as we move on today, as we're open to it. So just a quick look at the overall structure before I turn it over to Ed for a little bit of details. We're building the day, the time together around three thematic panels, each of which has had an initial sort of vetting and ground truthing as we worked this morning, plus a public celebration tomorrow morning at the usual time here at Aspen Chapel. But we're going to explore three themes. Thomas's understanding of unity or oneness, and how he got there, particularly at the very costly end of his life, which was not an easy departure from this life. So we're going to explore that in the first panel. The second panel is a departure from what you may have on your program, because that's how the Spirit works. And as we discovered where the energy lay in the group, what emerged was an inquiry into the relationship between suffering, selfhood, and transformation. So we're going to talk about that. And then tomorrow we're going to talk about holding the post, how we step forward in a world in which we are receiving assistance from a cosmos which is purposeful and evolutionary in its trajectory, and what we're really being called toward collectively and individually in practice. So we'll explore each of these topics as springboards for discussion. Each segment this afternoon will begin with a video clip. Ed has beautifully pulled stuff out of the Spiritual Paths archive that begins to lead us into the theme to be discussed. Then we'll invite the designated panelists up here, introduce them briefly so you know who's holding the space. They'll have a short conversation to get this thing started. We can invite some of our larger resource people in, and floor is open then to conversation from all of you. We'll ask only that anyone who's sitting here facing me, when you make a comment, stand so we can all see you. The mic will be passed, and you'll be fully included in it. So we'll remind you of that. Okay, Ed, do you want to continue on then, my dear? Couldn't have done it without this.
You got the tall and the short of it right here, Kathy.
Yeah. Yin and yang.
This is the power right here. Right. Mike, do you have this mic working? The lav? Mm-hmm. Testing, 1, 2, 3. Mm-hmm. Can you hear it on that?
Yeah.
Well, I'm really humbled to be standing before you, because so many of you could be standing here. Because so many of you here in the audience have just such a dear, precious, long relationship with Thomas Keating. So all of us here, I guess you could think of us as just folks who have been doing what you've been doing, but we happen to be part of the kind of the groups that Father Thomas birthed, and having been part of that because of our karma or whatever, because of the circumstances of our life. So I'm humbled to be here, and we wouldn't be here also if it weren't for the Aspen Chapel. In 2002, we began, thanks to a large part to Greg Anderson, and we began our programs right here. And from this place, and after the first 8 years, we had over 40 different teachers from many different traditions that taught with us here, down in Naropa, Garrison Institute, La Casa de Maria, Alehoc up in Canada, many different places around the country. It was a very dynamic, extraordinary time. And in fact, we were inventing, what is this form? We didn't really know, but we know that we had been deeply inspired by Father Thomas. and have been challenged in a way by Father Thomas to try to become the kind of progenitors of a new age. So I want to thank the staff. You have no idea how much work the Aspen Chapel has put into this event. It's just extraordinary, and the volunteers and the donors and all of you who have come from so far, many of the folks who have come as far away as Australia. So it's been a magnificent effort. So just to personalize it a bit, like you, most of you here, I wandered into Aspen my first trip in 1969, spent a few years, and at that early time I began to get some interest in Buddhism. I got hired to do a film with Lowell Thomas, with the Durances, and off to India we went, and did an interview with the Dalai Lama. And because I was with them in those circumstances, I was able then to work with a number of private sessions with him. And, he was 35, I was 24, something like that. So that gave me a jump start. He suggested that I go to the University of Wisconsin to work with a great Tibetan teacher and to do a PhD. So I was unmarried and no other responsibilities, had to show no previous aptitude in languages, but there I was at the University of Wisconsin learning Tibetan language and Sanskrit language, which led me then to living in Tibetan monasteries, refugee monasteries in India. And then after that, finishing my doctorate and then doing a series of films for the BBC on religion and then working at the Smithsonian. I say all that because by the time I returned to Aspen in 1989, I was quite arrogant about my Buddhism. I thought I was pretty damn special. I thought, what do Christians have to say about meditation? Not much. Not Jews, not much. I knew the Hindus had something. But and the Sufis, I heard a little bit about the Sufis. But I was pretty, I thought the Buddhists were really the cat's me out when it came to meditation. So I walked into the Explorer bookstore. And I went to the religion section. And there was this book, Open Mind, Open Heart, which many of you probably read. And I picked it up, I took it home, I read it, I said, man, this sounds like a lot like Buddhism. Really? I never knew this about Christianity. And who is this Father Thomas Keating anyway? So before too long, I made an appointment to go meet him out at St. Benedict's. And as all of you know who've done with Father Thomas, it was just an electric, stimulating, inspirational experience. And it began for us many years of dialogue then about Christian meditation and Buddhist meditation. And then one year, when the Buddhist in the group of the Snowmass Conference couldn't make it, so he looked and he said, I'm not going to try to imitate Father Thomas like you do so well. But he said, well, Ed, why don't you come this year and be the Buddhist? With a little wink and a smile. Like, if anybody could actually represent any tradition, the traditions are much too vast. And of course, I was delighted because all of us who were interested in meditation in the valley would look at what they did out there. It was like 16, 18 people would gather every year in a circle out at the monastery, and they would meditate. And they were from all these different traditions. Nobody had ever done that. I mean, a few people who were friends might have done it, but certainly not an esteemed abbot of a Catholic monastery. That was just unheard of. So I went to this session. That's where I met Swami and Roger and a number of the people who were there. And it was just absolutely transforming. Because suddenly, we were all sitting in silence, and what you could feel, which I often describe, is we're all sitting around a still pot. And it's as if we all have little pebbles that are dropping into that pot. And there are these concentric rings that are coming across the pot. And these concentric rings are intersecting with each other. So as if our individual, if there's such a thing, our individual consciousnesses we're permeating each other. We have made ourselves permeable. Our identities, fixed identities in the traditions that we were so proud of, like me and my newfound Buddhism, were softened. And we began to love the other traditions. So out of that created milieu, out of that experiment, came a totally new form. And in about year 2000, you can correct me, when Wayne Teasdale published a book, 1999, where he introduced the word interspiritual. And we were trying to think of a word that would connote the work that we were doing, where we're actually blending consciousness, deep heart and consciousness amongst our traditions. Interspiritual fit. So since about 2000, 2002, we've been calling our work interspiritual, and it caught on. So interspirituality is emerging as a new paradigm in our culture. It's something that we're beginning to nurture. It's an impulse. You know, if you read the polls, like the Pew Trust polls, 35 to 40% of Americans no longer claim a religious identity. A great percentage of those have never even been in a religious institution. And those folks, they need what all human beings have needed forever, which is a sense of who they are essentially, how they connect to a grander truth, and how they can live their lives with meaning and purpose. If they don't have a local religious institution to go to, where are they going to go? The internet. They're going to go to all the different sources of knowledge that are pervading our culture now. And if they're lucky, they might find a great teacher in teaching. They might find something that will do what we all need, which is to learn who we really are, who we connect with, what will happen when we die, how we live a life of meaning and purpose that's going to be good for each individual and for the planet. Here again, the word interspiritual fits, because this now word and this paradigm is ripe and ready for what we're now calling the spiritual but not religious, the espionage. In addition to all the folks that don't have a religion, there are many folks maybe here in this room that say they are Episcopal or Presbyterian or whatever, but it's only a name. But they're borrowing like everybody else. Now, Matthew, who's an Episcopal priest, he has initiations, right, in Sufism and Hinduism, right? Many of the people here that we've gathered together, everybody in this room, has been, during the course of their life, borrowing and putting together a path for themselves. So what we're doing now is this grand experiment, and with Cynthia's leadership and with the participation of all these folks that have come together, what we're doing right now is an experiment. Tomorrow morning, there's an interspiritual service. That's an experiment. So we're in the midst of this grand creativity around which we can help people of all faiths, no faiths, find a common heart that they can bond together that will help solve the horror divisions that we're now facing in the world. It's a hope for the future. So what we're all trying to do together is figure this out, put it together. And there will be as many forms of interspirituality developed as there were sects of different religions. But it'll all be dynamic and it'll all be really interesting. So we're standing on the shoulders of Father Thomas Keating, we're standing on the shoulders of Brother Wayne Teasdale, of B. Griffiths, of Thomas Burton, and we're all doing our best to bring this work into our lives and into the world. So as Cynthia shared, we have these three topics. Two of them are going to be this afternoon. And what you can expect is, at the beginning, a little bit of silence, a video, a bit of a panel, some presentations, and discussions that will include many of us, as well as then some final meditation at the end. So I invite you now, and I'm going to invite Mike up there. You can lower the screen now, and invite you all just to take a little stand-up stretch break while we get ourselves ready for the first panel. Just stretch in place, because we'll be beginning pretty soon. Thank you so much for being here, engaging in this experiment.
Yeah. Okay, so we're ready to run with it?
So we should do
So centering prayer is an introduction
All right.
into this
We're off with it?
presence of God. Use the term God, which will include, of course, Allah and the Great Spirit, Rahman, and any other Allah, other titles that the God has picked up in the course of centuries. He has many names, none of which come anywhere near to describing him, of course. So no name is as good as a name for God. And perhaps his best name is the nameless one. Once in a while, the human family as a whole gets an insight into its oneness. It's hard to get it from rational thinking because we're more aware of our differences and barriers and the various structures of society that create barriers between people. But almost all of the messages that are coming through are beginning to insist upon this message of the basic interconnectedness, interdependence, and unity of absolutely everything in the universe. So this is where you meet God in a new way that reinforces now the revelations of the great religions, and especially the wisdom teachers of the great religion, who have been saying for centuries that the human race is one, it has one source, as the Buddhists say, the 10,000 things, meaning everything, and I are the same thing, that is, have the same source. We have great diffusion. So the trick is, which is actually not a trick, but a final meeting with reality as it is the realization that everything is both one and diverse at the same time. Ramana Maharshi, the great Hindu mystic and the one who kind of embodies the Advaitic Hindu tradition from every perspective, he said, as we heard this morning, worth repeating, those two sentences from the Old Testament is all you need to know about practice. Be still, and you will know that I am God. In every situation, just be still. In every situation, just shut up. And relax into the present. Then, once you have accepted reality, including yourself, then you may decide or feel moved to address the issue in some way. But then it comes not from the false self, but from the center, from the inspired place where we're receiving little by little the divine therapy or healings. And so the first step then is simply to let go of the external world that we happen to be in. For many of us, this might require a vestibule of some kind, just as the church has a vestibule between the street and the sanctuary. So a little reading or a little exercise, especially a meditative one that is designed for this kind of practice, like yoga exercises, or a walk around the block, or a shower. We'd even allow a cup of coffee, but something to calm the intensity of the effects of the environment as we sit down, close our eyes. And so, in our intention then, all of this area of knowledge is let go of. Then one moves to the letting go of the interior dialogue. And this involves any kind of self-reflection. How am I doing? It was better yesterday. Why did I ever start this? There are too many thoughts. These are all thoughts that are more harmful to the movement towards interior stillness than just letting them come and letting them go. But since we have so many thoughts, most people in the beginning seem to require a symbol of their intention. So we're opening to what is, as it is, and we're surrendering ourselves, whatever that is, just as we are. So the best disposition, the one that corresponds to secrecy, is to forget yourself during the prayer, or any expectation, or any evaluation of it. The fruits of it can only be found in daily life, not in the psychological experience itself. So most people will choose a sacred word, which is sacred not because of its inner meaning, but because of the meaning you give it as an expression of your consent, as though you were deliberately relaxing as a child in the arms of the Abba, or the ultimate reality conceived as personal. And then when thoughts, as they inevitably will, come down the stream of consciousness, one gently, without effort, with the minimum of effort at least, returns mentally to the sacred word that you've chosen. And that should be short, maybe 1 or 2 syllables, like could be God, or Jesus if you have that tradition, Allah. It could be listen, peace, stillness. The meaning of the word is not important. What is important is the meaning you give it as the symbol of a gesture of your intention. Holy Spirit of God, draw us inwardly to your presence, where you always dwell. Anoint us with the gifts and fruits of the Spirit. Heal the wounds of a lifetime. Transform us through your presence into who we really are and into who you are.
So I'll invite our panelists up for the first panel. The most agile amongst you can take the perch. Age before beauty. All right, let's see. We had, who was? Yeah, you were there too, dear Kabir. So we're going to be having a conversation around Thomas's understanding of or vision of unity or oneness. And as we've already sort of picked up around the edges, this is really a three-pronged oneness, and you can't really separate the 3 threads or prongs. There's oneness or unity as a state of consciousness. something that most of us in this room would be comfortable calling non-duality today, and a sense of selfhood that goes with it, the non-dual realized oneness of selfhood. The second is his deep commitment to the oneness of all the sacred traditions, their underlying common ground. And while it was never discovered whether that oneness was sameness or diversity, that there was still this deep sense that there's something underneath all the particularity, like a light shining through. That's the second thread, the oneness of religions. And the third, and probably the one not to lose track of, is the oneness of all sentient beings, the oneness of our world as we move forward into the future. Certainly the oneness of humankind, but I think towards the very end of his life, Thomas was thinking more and more too, was becoming increasingly aware, moving beyond our sort of Judeo-Christian separation from nature, to understanding the oneness of all planetary existence. Rocks, animals, the biosphere, all is one, not just human beings. So there are these three obviously intertwined understandings that we wanted to get at. What we asked the panel a little bit this morning as we pondered these questions were, did you see a change or a development personally in Thomas's understanding of oneness over the years? And are there any aspects of his understanding of oneness, that might seem to you uniquely and intrinsically Christian? Or did his understanding of oneness cause him in a way to move beyond the container that launched him and to become in some deep way post-Christian and universal? We pondered those questions a little bit this morning. We may pick up with them this afternoon, or it may go in a different direction. But how did he get there, and what did it look like for him? Just to quickly introduce, if you don't know our panelists, Will Keepan, old friend of Thomas, represents and was formed in the Vedanta tradition, has done much work with his partner Cynthia Briggs in the world in reconciliation, gender reconciliation, race reconciliation, in broken areas in Africa, and has really been working to put the global vision of oneness in place. Kabir Helmizki, our Sufi sheikh, speaking about oneness, one of the core founding faculty from Spiritual Paths, upholding the spiritual, the Christian, the Western understanding of the point of view, that the interesting dialectic between oneness and particularity. Swami Atmarupananda, from the Ramakrishna branch of the Vedanta order, one of the very, very early participants in the Snowmass Conference, a charter member once again of the Spiritual Paths movement. We'll shed light on it from that perspective. And Justin, our perch sitter, Justin Lanier, who lived and worked under Thomas for 2 years as a novice in St. Benedict's Monastery, has considerable under his belt tradition in the Zen traditions of Buddhism, time logged in Japan, in the monasteries there, and now paying his dues, as we all wind up doing, as an Episcopal priest, which he's completely non-identified with.
I represent.
I asked us all to get dressed up in ceremonial garb, and Justin alone had the guts to take me seriously. So we turn it over to you in whatever order you feel moved to jump in to talk about your understanding of Thomas's understanding of oneness, personal stories, helps from your tradition, wherever it lands. why don't you have the mic, Swami, why don't we start out with you?
Okay, thank you, Cynthia. I'm not going to try to give a complete picture of the ideas I want to mention, because that's not our purpose here. It's to stimulate discussion, stimulate thought, etc. So I want to mention about Father Tom's aspiration towards oneness, and it's not just aspiration, it's growth towards oneness. And the three aspects of that growth towards oneness, very briefly. For him, oneness was God. The growth towards oneness meant the growth towards God, consciousness of God, joining the heart to God, love of God, etc. But that was an ongoing process. It was an evolutionary process of his own growth, as it is for all of us. All of us on a spiritual quest, our quest is evolutionary. We are searching. If we've already found, then we're not searching. And so he was searching. From the time that I first met him in 1984, there was a great deal of growth seen in him. An extraordinary man, as all of you know. But central to all of that was his growth into the awareness of and the joining of the heart to, and perhaps the joining of his being to God. So God was a term for oneness. But then the question comes, well, what holds us back from oneness? From the standpoint of my own tradition, I'm not going to speak about myself and my tradition, but just to mention briefly, from the standpoint of my tradition, the Vedanta tradition of Hinduism, oneness already exists. It's not something that has to be created. It's something that has to be realized, something to be seen. And I think Father Tom was very much in tune with that idea also. And so what is it that keeps us from oneness? If oneness is a fact, and of course for Tom, God was a fact, what is it that keeps us from oneness? One of the things that keeps us from oneness is the self. Or actually the central thing that keeps us from God is our sense of self, our sense of being separate, our sense that I am here and you are there. I'm me and you are you. This is mine, don't touch it. That's yours, I won't touch it. This sense that I'm separate from the universe, I'm separate from other people, I'm separate from God. As I grow in the spiritual path, I may develop love for God, but still there's that sense of separation. And so we saw in Father Tom a growing sense of that the sense of the separate self as the separator between oneself and God. But that understanding of the self, it gradually grew. He began to speak more and more in psychological terms, as in my experience, at least in my limited experience of him, speaking of the false self, the self which is built of our fears and our neuroses and so forth, and trying to mature out of those fears, those neuroses, into an abandonment to God. So one of the things that separates us from God is that sense of separateness. Another thing is, as part of that separate self, is our ideas about God. And so his idea of God was constantly evolving. He would say, as he saw in the film we saw, that whether you call God God or Allah or by any other name, he said at one time, you can call him Butch if you want to. The name doesn't matter. So his approach towards the unity was an approach towards God, which included the making transparent of the individual self. Making transparent of the individual self, so that became less and less a dividing factor between self and God. And then taking down the structures that had been built up explaining God so that he could approach God itself, not even himself, but God itself. And that I saw in him. Say this not to be provocative, but I remember once in one of our Snowmass meetings in the mid-90s, he was about to say something and he said, no, I don't know if this is good Catholic doctrine. I don't know if it's Catholic doctrine at all. But now my experience is that of the self becoming more and more transparent, the self beginning to disappear, and the no self becoming dominant. he got to a point where that allowed him to enter into the spirit of other religions more and more. In the beginning, with his interspiritual work, it was an interest in other traditions, seeing some sort of similarity, but not quite knowing what the basis of that similarity was, exploring that similarity, and then coming to a point later in his life where he said it's not enough to accept or to appreciate other religions. We must love other religions, and love them from the inside, love them experientially from the inside. And so that way also he was approaching unity. Unity from the standpoint of deconstructing the limiting definitions we have of God and coming closer to the being of God. And in that, finding unity with other religions. So his deconstruction of the limiting self, the deconstructing of religious definitions which separate us, and then finally his sense of oneness with the world around him, starting with people. As all of you who knew him, all of you who met him know, he had an extraordinary capacity to touch everyone that he met, an extraordinary capacity to communicate, to express a oneness with the other person, an understanding of the other person. And so that grew over time as I observed Father Tom, until he had an extraordinary quality to enter into the other person, to commune with the other person as if from the inside. And finally, as Cynthia mentioned, that began to expand out into a recognition of what might be called the divine presence, the presence of the ultimate reality, expressing itself as the whole universe, where it was no longer just unity with people, but unity with the universe itself. And so I'll end by saying that, just summing that up, that he began by that impulse towards unity, the impulse towards knowing God, which was what brought him into the monastery to begin with. And then finding what it was that separated him from God, the constructed self, the false self, the definitions of God which served to distance God, which served to put God in a box, the deconstruction of that, and then the separation of the barriers between self and the world around him.
You want me to go next? Okay. I met Thomas when I was 18. I started studying with him. And this first experience was about 10 years in. And just as a disclaimer, I have done my impersonation of Thomas in front of Thomas. Okay?
Okay.
He said, "I don't sound like that." So if I slip into my impression, forgive me. So Thomas and I would meet on a regular basis, and this meeting, we were regularly talking about the self and no self, false self, true self. Okay. And you know, I was a little, let's say, gutsy. So I was in the meeting with him, very close, in his cell, and I said, "So Thomas, where are things for you now?" Now, those of you who have talked with Thomas know there are some times when Thomas is plugged in. And when he is plugged in, it's just unbelievable. And he was plugged in this time. He said, he's closing his eyes, leaning back in his chair. It's like a sliver of consciousness, like a fingernail or the moon. Well, I'd never heard that before. And that's how that meeting ended. I went back in the monastery you write a little note, TK. You plug it up on the board. He gets the note. He writes on the back of that note, come see me, blah, blah, blah. Boom, goes back on the board, says Justin on there. Boom, I pull it off. Okay. Go the next day to meet him. Thomas, yesterday you said consciousness was just a sliver. What did you mean by that? I didn't say that. That doesn't even sound like something I'd say. He wasn't plugged in that day. He didn't even remember saying it. That's how that meeting ended. The next meeting was 20 years later. And we're meeting in the infirmary. And we're meeting there, and it's one of these, for me, one of these epic meetings. And I didn't ask about no self or anything. He didn't tell me. He took me on like a little journey. It's like he was transmitting, or he was pulling me into his experience for a little bit. And so we're sitting there, knee to knee, and he says, there comes a time when you are falling in the abyss, and it seems like no one is helping you. Like no one is coming to your help. Not the Virgin Mother, no saint, not Jesus, just desolation. And while he's explaining this, he's taking me there. And then he says, you fall and fall and fall in this groundless abyss until you are shattered on that groundless ground into a billion pieces, and each one is born as God. And that is how that meeting ended.
Ooh.
So we were talking today at lunch about that story, and I was saying that each one of us who had a really close connection to Thomas received in our hearts one of those pieces. Because that's what he did. He basically gave himself to be dismembered into pieces of God to give to all of us. And I just want to speak briefly about oneness in terms of a whole interaction that we had that was somehow very instructive for me. I was working on a book on the universal path of divine love across the theistic traditions, and he wrote the foreword for it. And so in that foreword, he was speaking to the essence of this oneness across the traditions. And he talked about it as the principle of ultimate reality, which when realized takes you to a transcendence of your own tradition. And we went through many drafts. Earlier, I think it was a total of 14 drafts of that. I mean, he did back and forth between us, of that foreword that he wrote. Half of them were just kind of normal editing, but the other half were his having to nuance what he was saying there, because he was getting criticism from some of his colleagues, I think, within the clergy, within the Catholic clergy, about just what he could say and how much he could say. But the essence of it came down to this. There's what Swami was saying about that, what Thomas so often emphasized, and really the whole birth of the interspiritual work, as I think you all know, he founded it, this Snowmass conference, because, as he put it, I went to all these interfaith conferences, and you know what? They were boring, except for the meals and the breaks.
Yeah.
And so I decided I'm going to do a gathering, an interfaith gathering that has no presentations. We'll just have meals and breaks, plus some prayers. And of course, it's very funny, but it was actually the truth, because it was in the meals and the breaks where the deep heart-to-heart conversations could happen, and the cross-traditional wisdom could be shared from a personal stance of how my tradition has transformed my being. And those are the conversations that we're often missing in traditional interfaith comparative theology discourse. So anyway, in this foreword, because one of the principles that I had drawn strongly from was the work of Meister Eckhart for my kind of reference to Christian mysticism. And Meister Eckhart says something very profound. He says that the Godhead is as far above the three persons of God, or the Trinity, as heaven is above the earth. And he says that God the first self-effusion of God is into Christ, but in so doing, God reduces himself to Father. And so there is an ontological levels there. There's an absolute Godhead. And then there's the Trinity. And what Thomas was saying was that when we come to love other traditions, it's not enough just to respect them, as Swami was saying. When we come to love other traditions, he said, what I mean by that is that we engage with those traditions to the point that we actually experience, or at least recognize, but experience ultimate reality within that tradition, which connects us to our own experience of the transcendent in our own tradition. And so in that way, through the recognition of this shared universal, we recognize the other traditions are legitimate pathways to the same realization. And I just want to add one last piece, which is, because we talk about the universal, shared universal across the traditions, and I think that that's in some ways widely recognized in the perennial philosophy and particularly in the emergent interspiritual discourse. But I think there's also a close similarity in terms of praxis across the traditions. So if you consider the theistic traditions, they all have this teaching of taking refuge in God. And in many cases, it's part of the supreme teaching, like at the end of the Bhagavad Gita, it's part of the supreme secret, the Charama Shloka, where Krishna says this is more secret than all that is secret, and the secret is to take refuge in God alone. So, but we also find it in the non-theistic traditions, Buddhism, for example, where we take refuge in the three treasures, the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha. And one of Thomas's favorite ways of kind of summarizing the spiritual path, he would say, it begins by the recognition that there is this other, this supreme glorious other that's much greater than I. And then as you enter into the transformative path, what happens is that you become that other, and then you recognize there is no other. Now that process of becoming that other is entered into by a process of taking refuge. In the theistic case, you take refuge in what we call God. In Buddhism, one of the non-theistic traditions, we take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha. But the actual process of taking refuge and prostrating oneself before something greater and more glorious, before this supreme reality, then begins a mysterious process, a mysterious alchemy in which one is then essentially transformed by the other into the other, and then recognizes there is no other. So in that way, there's a kind of oneness of praxis across the traditions, as well as a oneness of the human being with the essence of the absolute supreme, so that the inmost essence of the human being is none other than the absolute. And we see this obviously in Christianity, I and the Father are one, or where Jesus says, whoever sees me sees the Father. But we also find it in Buddhism. Buddha says essentially the exact same thing. Whoever sees me sees the Dharma. Whoever sees the Dharma sees me. So we have this kind of remarkable consistency of this oneness, even across the theistic and non-theistic traditions.
Thank you, friends. I appreciate you went ahead of me because you have more to say about Thomas, your relationship with him than I do. And though we had 8 years or so of teaching together, a number of retreats, you were, 2 of you at least, were his students. So we wanted people to hear from you. I've benefited from the legacy of Father Thomas by being brought into the Spiritual Paths Foundation and this experience of interspirituality, which I don't think we really saw as a path. I want to be clear about that. We're not proposing interspirituality as a path. Unless you want that, that's fine. Most of us were people trained in specific traditions. And we know none of us were unaware of the transcendent unity of religions, of the perennial philosophy, but it's one thing to hear about it and to agree to it intellectually. It's another thing to share your life with brothers and sisters of these other traditions and hear about our experiences. And for me, it was after being really kind of been almost hermetically sealed into the Sufi tradition for 20-some years, and then meeting these brothers and sisters who were on sort of parallel paths. Many of us, most of us actually, having chosen traditions not the traditions we were born into. And so we'd been traveling, like ships at sea, on parallel journeys, and then we came together. We docked in the port that Ed Bastian opened up, the harbor he opened up for us. We began to compare notes, and then we could really see how the experiences we had passed through, and I mean experientially, what we had learned about the nature of the self, about the distractions of egoism, about a relationship to something spiritual, a spiritual reality. And this, as Ed said, I think we all softened in that process, and our hearts opened more, and loving relationships formed, beautiful friendships and respect for each other and support for each other formed out of this experience. So this was a living experience of that oneness, a oneness which until that time had been, it's kind of a boring subject, really, oneness. It's so abstract. And I get it, okay, enough. I've heard enough about this. Oneness, sure. Well, but then how about all these problems we face even with people we're so close to? People of our own religion, people of our own orders, where some of the deepest conflicts transpire. This is the way it is. But I'd like to attempt to speak about something, speak about oneness through the lessons that I've learned, or attempted to learn through our master Jalaluddin Rumi. Many people know Rumi for lots of one-liners, of ecstatic utterances and affirmations, all religions are one, and this kind of thing. But actually, Rumi's masterwork is a 6-volume book of 22,000 rhymed couplets in which he weaves together narratives, stories that sometimes go 60 or 70 pages, but are interrupted by other sub-stories and punctuated by sublime poems and prayers, and sometimes utterly vulgar jokes, all mixed into this tapestry of life. And what does he say about this book? And this was his final magnum opus in the later years of his life. It was his teaching materials. He said, this is the workshop of oneness. And he said, it's like if you walk into a shoemaker's shop and you see like a piece of metal on the floor, and you wonder, well, what is that piece of metal for? I don't know. But it must have something to do with making shoes. Same thing with the poems, prayers, jokes, fables in Rumi. Everything there, in all the diversity of life, is about this oneness. And it does something to your mind to attempt to study this work, to read it. Well, that's a whole other subject. It forces you to, like no other literature I can think of, to be able to hold many things in the mind and heart simultaneously. You have to read it linearly because words come in a linear order. But if you just take it section by section, you read a section of maybe 4 or 5 pages, and then you attempt to hold, well, what's going on here? What's the message? Because the way he weaves together the themes is quite extraordinary. So it even has literature. It's a demonstration of the reality of oneness. But what he's getting at, and sometimes he's very explicit about it, sometimes he's only hints at it, but there's something amidst all the diversity, amidst all of the pain and grief of life, and all the pleasures and joys of life, and all of the satisfactions and disappointments of life, there's something going on. Something relentlessly arranging circumstances, events, as if there was some vast, this sounds like a fable, it sounds like a fairy tale. As if there is some vast, intelligent, generous love collaborating for your benefit. And people will ask, but what about all the sorrows of life and the pain that we've experienced and incredible loss, and why does such and such a thing happen to an innocent child, or why do innocent people die? And Rumi's answer, which is not his answer, it is not an original thought from him. It is from the tradition he was a part of, a tradition which believes the essence of reality is this overwhelming divine mercy. Mercy not in the sense of, have mercy on you, a poor sinner, not that at all, but a kind of beneficence that is so awesome and yet hidden often, so profound and powerful and subtle and intelligent that every particle of existence is participating in this plot, in this conspiracy to help you, me, us understand the very nature of love. And that the most important experiences of life for all of us are experiences of love. Not romantic love, not the love that wants to claim and possess, the love that melts the ego, the loves that brings tears, not of loss, but tears of recognition. And that this love is operating in the most horrific conditions of war, as much as it's operating in the bedchamber with the beloved. And this is another kind of oneness. Amidst all the diversity, conflicts, contrasts of this life, this amazing life we've been given. If we pay attention, if we can learn as a first step to be grateful, that's a good beginning. And as another further step, to trust not trusting that everything's going to turn out the way you want it, but to trust that there is this divine beneficence behind everything, and that the whole purpose of creation is to reveal the truly awesome dimensions of this divine love, that is the whole purpose of existence. Yes, we can call that unity if we like. We can call it oneness. It is the oneness of love, as if all of these universes were created from a spark of love. And love is the path, and love is the final goal and recognition. So this is something not to be believed, not to take as a dogma, but to ask ourselves, truly, do I see any evidence? Has life given me any evidence of this? And if you have experienced the darkest realities of humanity up close, and you've looked objectively and asked your heart, and if you have asked these questions deeply and emptied yourself of preconceptions and silenced the busy mind and reactive emotions, and then face reality, what do you find? And that's all. That's all that one can ask. You will find what you find. Hopefully you will find what is real, beyond your opinions, beyond your social conditioning, your prejudices of your family or society. And when confronting the most difficult circumstances of life, if you can apply these spiritual principles, which Father Thomas also exemplified beautifully for us, then you can fall into the abyss. And you can see, by the way, what was shattered was the mirror. When the mirror is shattered, all it can do is reflect God in a million pieces. Thank you.
Thank you. So what you're saying, and I'm wondering what the other panelists would say about this, what it touches off, and for any of you in the front row at first. So you're saying, Kabir, that oneness is not what you might call a glib oneness that cancels out pain or contradiction. It doesn't cancel out suffering, but it brings some other dimension to it. And that it's this dimension that really is the pearl of great price, as it were. Is that what you were?
Well said.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
Another dimension, which is also this dimension, not separate from this dimension, but it's a purposefulness. It is that divine mercy that we can know. And yet there are tests. Life brings us tests. And we see that those who have lived with gratitude and trust and faith, which is not the same as belief, with a trust in the spiritual nature of reality, this changes everything. And this leads to something, slowly, patiently, to a way of being in this world that recontextualizes our pain, our suffering, our loss, our grief, as well as our joy and happiness. We can only say, thank you, thank you, thank you for the beautiful moments, for the beautiful friendships, for the terrible losses. And all of it serves that one truth. All of it highlights and magnifies that one truth, that fundamentally these are all lessons of love if we can take them as such.
Any of you sitting up there have any responses that you would make to Kabir? What's this touching off for any of you? Justin, I'm hearing your little shards of love, and I'm hearing your shards, and every shard becomes God, and I'm hearing Kabir talking about everything. What's going on for you guys?
I'd just like to add that from the perspective of the greatest saints that you find in the world's traditions, there is a state that is beyond pain. There is a state beyond pain. There is a state beyond contradiction. It doesn't mean that that at this level there are not contradictions. That's the nature of this level of experience. But sometimes we have a tendency to think that what I'm experiencing now, I have some devotion, I have some spiritual experience, I have some spiritual evolution, whatever degree it is, that I still see contradiction, I still have pain, I still suffer, and so forth. But there is a state beyond that. That's what the Buddha said, that's what the Hindu tradition said, that's what many of the great Christian saints experienced also. That yes, when we're in the body, pain is associated with the body. But there's a state where even that becomes transformed. You still see it as pain. There is still the element of suffering. But all of this is to say that I don't think we should forget the transcendent level of spirituality, because it's true. I myself have seen people who have attained to that state. And so yes, in the state where I am, I still experience pain, I still experience contradiction and so forth. But there is a level where that becomes resolved, and that even those who living in the body have experienced that perfect union with God, then even pain is transformed. Yes, they may still say, ouch, if you pinch them. They may still speak of the sufferings of the body, but it's not the pain as we experience it, and it's not contradiction as we experience it, because in the oneness of the divine being, or in the oneness of enlightenment, or however we define it, that their contradiction is resolved. And when we come back from that, I'm not saying me, Swami Atmarupananda, because I'm still working towards that. But if I had attained that and I come back here, then I would see contradiction and I would see pain from a completely different perspective. I wouldn't see it from the personal perspective that, oh, I'm hurting, and oh, this doesn't seem to make sense with that. No, everything to that consciousness makes sense. So I again, this is the last thing I'll say on this, is that we shouldn't forget the transcendent level, because that is there also. And that's the experience of saints of all the different traditions who have attained to that.
You reminded me a little bit of what I sometimes call Thomas's fish. Sorry, this seat is a little uncomfortable. So, this is short. My first Thanksgiving in the monastery, sat next to Father Thomas. Ooh. Sat next to Father William Menninger. Oh, I thought this was the prize seat in the house. Neither one of them said a single word for the whole Thanksgiving dinner. There was a reason no one was sitting next to them. One of the main course was salmon. Someone caught salmon somewhere where salmon is amazing. Mm-hmm. And then they shipped it to the monastery. And then we cooked it perfectly. And then we ate it together, except for Thomas. I sat down, put my plate down, nice big piece of amazing salmon. We didn't eat meat very often in the monastery. And he looked at it, and he made the strangest face. I don't think he even knew he made it. Come to find out, Thomas did not like fish. Now, my experience of Thomas was everything from transcendent to things I can't talk about that are hilarious. And so many years later, he's in the infirmary. And to wonder about, here's this, to me, this master who is in unity or unicity, or this exalted, ordinary, just plain, simple state. And I'm in the infirmary, and someone is cooking fish. So he says, "Please shut the door." He still didn't like fish. And that for me was a good example of whatever no self, true self, whatever state of being and consciousness he was in, the distinctions were still there, and they weren't a hindrance at all. So I always think of Thomas's fish whenever I consider, does he still like fish or not? I don't think it matters.
It's very interesting, Justin, that you raise the story and bring it back to Thomas, because after we take our break and meditate together, we're going to look a little bit more about the surprise topic that came up this afternoon. We hadn't really been expecting it would, but in some sense there was a lot of hardship and even you might call suffering involved in Thomas's final transformation to unity. And it wasn't an easy road to bliss, as you would like to say in the cheap and dirty story of, this happy, simple guy who just bounced happily into nirvana, that it didn't work that way. And we're going to take some time, and it certainly is going to color what we're going to do, because there are some very profound reasons why that's so. But in a little bit, to shake it up and to get some younger and some women's voices in here too, before we turn it over to some comments from the floor, I'd like to invite Felina and Bree, in whatever order you wish. You were there with Thomas there in the Young Contemplatives Conference, in which you shared a pretty powerful transmission of oneness and difficulty. I wondered if you'd like to speak about that at all. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Stand up,
Yeah.
turn around.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Look at you all.
Introduce yourself.
Hi, my name's Felina. I live in Omaha, Nebraska, and I co-founded a center called Gravity. It's a center for contemplative activism, and I do that work with my husband, and Thomas was a founding board member for us, along with Richard Rohr. So that's a little bit about where I come from. But we were with Thomas, gosh, what year was that? A few years back, 2 years ago. I lose track of time. It was about 2 years ago, and there was a small group of us gathered with him. And it was the most profound meeting that I'd ever had with him. He was very generous with his time, and Eric had told us that he wasn't well, and this was during the New Contemplative Exchange gathering. And Thomas had generously invited all of us there from these various different contemplative communities, and he wasn't well, and so we didn't know if we'd actually get to see him, even though we'd all gathered at Snowmass because he'd brought us there. But every day we just took it one day at a time, and he was very generous with whatever energy he had, and so we managed to arrange a meeting, and he was asking us, how are you? Each of us very interested in how each of us were doing. And then one of us in the group asked Thomas, "So how are you?" And he paused, and then he said, I can't impersonate him as well as, maybe you could do it.
I'm tapped out.
He says, "Well, I'm busy dying." Yeah. And most of us are pretty young, and we're not all that well acquainted with what it's like to die. And as you know, Thomas was dying for many, many years, it seemed, you know? Like, we were always wondering, is this the last, you know? And he always came back. And he'd stay with us for longer. And then we'd think, maybe this is the last year he'll be with us. And then somehow he stuck around, you know? And so he said, I'm busy dying. And then after that settled, someone asked, what's that like? And then there was a greater pause, and I remember he looked out the window, turned his eyes from us out the window, looked at the meadow, and I felt he was doing that as a way of pondering, you know, can we really handle the response? And then he said, it's the hardest work of my life. It was so powerful, you know, you could just feel the density of what he was saying. And what I love about this is that it was so right on to the way he lived his entire adult life, at least, right? This commitment to the path of dying, of becoming nothing, of self-emptying. And in the last years of his life, the fruit of that. And we had the extraordinary gift of encountering that fruit. And it reminded me of that, that gospel passage, that wisdom saying about, you know, unless a grain of wheat falls to the ground and breaks open, it will not bear fruit. And in the remaining moments that we had with him, you know, time stood still, and I don't know that any of us could remember the words that he was saying, but including Father Richard Rohr, who was with us, we were all broken open. The power of a life that was dying and broken open, you know, had this power to break open us. And in those moments, we were being transformed. We were being changed. It was essence to essence, doing something within us what words cannot do, you know, in each of us in a different way. And so it was extraordinarily powerful kind of transmission of a life that is committed to this path of suffering and dying and becoming nothing so that a source greater than us can be realized through us in the service of one another.
Bree, would you add?
Hi, everyone. I don't know that I have a lot more to say about that specific encounter, except to just name that those of us who were in the room with him felt the physicality of that work. This was not suffering up here. This was physical hard work, bodily suffering, bodily work. There was this deeply embodied, incarnational presence that he brought to us, that somehow was a part of the transmission, that it was through this physical realm, in this particular way, with all the contradictions and tension points that exist. And I think the only thing that I want to add is, as I was listening to you all share, I kept thinking about two lovers. You know, it's like they just want to just erase the distance between them, and they try really hard to dissolve the distance in really creative ways, and yet they can't, right? Like, the love between two lovers cannot dissolve the distinctions and the particularities that make them who they are, which is why they love each other in the first place. When a lover says to another person, I am, they don't say, I am, make me more. They say, I am, may you be. There's this spondic energy of love that is what I think creates some of this unity that we're describing. Love becomes then not dissolving into each other, but looking in the same direction, traveling together toward a shared hope of what we're becoming together. And I feel that there was something about that gathering that he was doing that for and with us. I am, may you be.
Any out here in our larger groups? Yeah, okay. Okay, there's a...
I'd like to add to a little bit of that dying process. Thomas had such a strong belief that he was absolutely going through the death and resurrection. And you couldn't shake that away from him at all. There'd be times sitting with him where he would say, well, it started with the feet, and then it moved to the legs, and it kept moving up and up. And about the time of the young people's gathering, he would say, well, now it's at my heart. And so he was really, really, really sharing his complete heart. And it's like you said, Justin, about the shattering and the fracturing. Every single piece was going back to all of us as God. And Swami, I landed there about 2 weeks before that first gathering, so I got to cook, you know. But in his later years, he became firm about the name of God, and it was Izzy.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about Will said about, you know, his thing about, there's nothing to be said. You know, this is all head stuff, neck up. The only important thing is breaks and meals, you know. So I had the great good fortune of being involved in the meals and not only feeding, but being fed largely. So unbelievable hearts broken wide open in gratefulness. And thank you, Cynthia and Ed, for bringing this all together.
Oh, yeah, sure.
I just want to say one word because something that I said in my first statement, I don't want to leave the wrong impression about Father Tom. That I talked about Father Tom, and Pat reminded me of this. That Father Tom went beyond the definitions and the structures and the boundaries that tried to close God within a box. But it wasn't that he left Christianity or Catholicism in any sense. It was just that the walls hemming him in, that they broke down. He remained where he was. And later I saw he came back and began to freely express through Orthodox in the non-Eastern Orthodox sense, but in the ordinary sense, Orthodox Christian terminology. He would speak in his later years much more about the Trinity and Trinitarian ideas in order to express the spirituality that he was experiencing. And so he didn't break down Christianity. He didn't leave Christianity, obviously. He just removed the barriers and the boxes so that he could see it again freshly and see the life-giving principles rather than the walls and boundaries.
Perfect. Other comments from the floor? Stand up and a mic will come in your way, but yeah.
Thank you for having this.
Keep
It's
it
quite
close
a
to
powerful
you.
story that you told. But a question came up in my mind when Kabir mentioned test, and something that happened in my past. I was wondering about, are tests random? And I don't know if the answer matters, but that question came into my head. Are tests random? And test, T-E-S-T. Yeah.
Question about tests?
Mm-hmm.
And however you can answer. Thank you.
Or is there randomness in spiritual tests? Do you think so?
I think so.
You think so? Well, this is something each person has to decide for themselves. is it possible, we hear, I have experienced it myself, and we hear many accounts about how the randomness and accidents of life become synchronicities, amazing synchronicities. And sometimes it depends on our state. It sometimes depends on our trust, our faith, our consent to reality, that the meaningfulness of events, it's as if it's dialed up. And in any case, it's what I believe and what I've experienced. And yet, I also know that we don't necessarily know the whys of these significant tests. It's not always apparent, especially in the moment that they're happening. But with time, a different understanding may come. But I think this is an honest question, and each person will decide in their own heart how they respond to the circumstances of life. But there's one thing that I'll add to what I said before, that maybe I didn't say it clearly enough. The mystic, the contemplative, comes to know increasingly a state within oneself that is independent of circumstances. I mean, right here and now, no matter what you're experiencing, and this is not to say the pain, it's not to say that we don't experience pain and loss and many other things, but is also accessible to us an experience of a state of being within ourselves, within our own hearts, where we are essentially invulnerable, where it is beyond circumstances. And the more we know that and experience that, the more we can, in a sense, become vulnerable on other levels of our being, with fewer defenses, with less fear, with greater trust and consent. Rumi's teacher said to him, one of the first lessons that Shamsi Tabriz gave to Rumi, he said, "You have a friend. And this friend is such that if there were an obstacle on your path that extended from one horizon to the next and from earth to heaven, this friend of yours would kick it aside out of the way with a single kick." And not only that, but the friend has done this many times before, and you're not aware of it. But this friend has one requirement of you. And this is Shams talking to Rumi. This is not me saying it. Shams talking to Rumi. He says, this friend has asked one requirement of you, that you greet every circumstance of life as if it's your greatest happiness. So I just leave you with that shocking teaching, those ridiculous words. Test them.
Just to add to that, whether these tests are random or not, the underlying principle that Kabir was speaking of is that, human life, we're here in a school of divine love. And love itself breaks your heart in order to increase your capacity to love. Rumi has this beautiful line where he says, love pierces the heart of every lover. Blood flows, but the wound is invisible. And this is the process of what my spiritual teacher called bloodless surgery, where you are basically completely scoured. Outwardly you look fine, but inwardly you're completely roto-rooted from the inside out. But this is done on purpose by a wisdom far greater than our own, because a broken heart can then become an instrument through which the earth and life heals itself. And so we offer ourselves as an instrument for that healing. It heals us, But once we're healed, it will then continue to break our hearts, to expand our capacity to be an instrument for healing in the world. And so heartbreak is essential on the path of divine love. You can't avoid it. And if you know anyone who's lost in their lives and they're trying to figure out, what do I do with my life? Joseph Campbell used to say, follow your bliss. But if you're interested in divine love, follow your heartbreak. Find what truly breaks your heart and go and place yourself in service of healing that.
Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. You know, the line that we go stammering through in the Christian tradition in the Lord's Prayer, lead us not into temptation, is more properly translated, they say, is do not give us tests beyond what we can bear. And there's this very, very powerful sense that what doesn't crush us so much that we can't recover so that we just go to bitterness will deepen our capacity to love. So it takes on deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper depth. And I think this is an extraordinary place to end the exploration in this first set and begin to segue into where we're going to look at in the second. This wonderful and yet horrific story of Thomas's final immolation of the heart in order that the capacity to love can become available to us as what you might call a cosmic force. And we'll be looking at that through some of the personal stories of the ones who stood by him and were with him in the moments of his death, in the last years of his life. And in this why suffering? Why suffering in a life that ought to know how to say, oh, move beyond. What's this all about? We'll be looking at that. So beautiful. Thank you all. For those who don't know who stood up the first from the floor, it's the beautiful and one-of-a-kind Pat Johnson, who has walked with Thomas on this whole path for 30 or 40 years, every step of the way, making it happen. God bless you, my dear. And we will take about a 15-minute break. One of your drills in becoming invulnerable to external conditions is probably what all of you won't get to use the loo in that time. So we will dispose you if you come in late. But afterwards, we are going to do a little bit of interspiritual meditation together, and then we'll go into session 2. So stretch out the body and thank it for bearing you this far. Heather?
Just to say before you go, there is lemonade and water outside on the balcony, so help yourself to that and to the loos. And just a heads up that at 6 o'clock, there's going to be the bookshop's coming from town, and they'll be selling a whole bunch of books out there at 6 o'clock.
About maybe they're setting up the meditation or some chat or something.
Yeah, we'll take care of that. Yeah, he's still with that.
We're running a little time.
Just a little bit, but we can. Yeah, I would say shorten it up just a little. We're about 12 minutes behind, which isn't too bad because we left some generous time for the panels. You know, we left an hour 15. I knew it.
It could be shorter because it's late in the afternoon.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay,
So we'll have